The plan for the evening is that I'm going to introduce my colleague, Kim Katie, who is also here with us, to talk quickly about the car and carriage transportation collection at the Frick Pittsburgh. After that, I will welcome Dr. Sorin and Dr. Barker for a conversation about the book, and then we'll spend the last 10 or 15 minutes happily answering your questions and carrying on the conversation to respond to what it is that you want to ask us. So it's my pleasure to introduce my curatorial colleague, Kim Katie, who is the curator of the Frick's Car and Carriage Museum collection. Kim takes care of the collection of Frick family vehicles and also early Pittsburgh automobiles. And she also installs really wonderful exhibitions that sort of give a color and social history to the collection that we have. And I think she just wants to share a little bit about that with you today. So thank you, Kim, and welcome.
Thank you. As has said, I'm the curator for the Car and Carriage Museum here at the Frick. And so we're going to just give a little overview of that collection, just for any newcomers we may have who are not familiar with the car museum. Maybe you've been to the Frick before and you've seen the art museum or the historic house Clayton, but maybe haven't gotten a chance to see the Car and Carriage Museum. So we're just going to talk a little bit about what we have here. So Helen Clay Frick was our benefactress who had the forethought as well as the immense wealth to save her family's carriage collection, preserving about 15 carriages for us of turn-of-the-century vehicles, including 2 automobiles as well, for the idea of creating this museum down the line. The unrestored carriage collection consists of family, formal, and sporting style vehicles. Here we have 2 of those vehicles, a tuxedo phaeton and a basket phaeton, and we can see from archival footage the family, Helen and her mother Adelaide, actually driving these vehicles. So in addition to the family's collection, the museum also received a sizable donation of brass and pre-war era vehicles from Pittsburgh industrialist G. Whitney Snyder. Thanks to Mr. Snyder's generous gift, as well as the donations of other local car enthusiasts in the area, the museum now cares for a mixed collection of about 42 vehicles. The vehicles date from 1881 through 1940 and include early electric, steam powered, and as well as gas powered cars. So nice little variety that we have here at the museum. Recently, the museum has enhanced the visitor experience, as Amanda was saying, with annual temporary exhibitions that focus on the effect transportation and specifically the automobile, what effect it has had on the American life. In 2017, Driving the Disenfranchised examined the role automobiles played in the success of the women's suffrage movement. So not only did cars provide mobility, autonomy, but also a literal stage for these women traveling across country conducting car-side talks. So it was very helpful in getting the word out and being visible in society, trying to get the vote for women in the early 20th century. So what brings us here today is that in 2022, we'll once again examine how the automobile changed lives. A yet to be titled exhibition will tell the story of the Great Migration, the period following the Civil War when African Americans fled the oppression and discrimination of Jim Crow laws in the South, traveling north and west, seeking greater access to a more equitable life. I want to take this time to thank Dr. Gretchen Sorin for not only joining us today, but for writing this wonderful, compelling, and informative book. It's been a great aid to helping me understand not only the topic, but researching it and helping me to create this exhibit for 2022. So one of the things that I really stood out for me in the book was a Pittsburgh Courier article that is quoted as saying the key to the movement being that of the civil rights movement of the 1960s was the key to an automobile. And I really think that stood out for me because having researched for the suffrage exhibit and kind of researching for this, it is true that without mobility, you can't make change. And so the automobile provided that change and that accessibility for women, for African Americans, and continues to provide that for us all today. So that is just kind of an overview of our collection and where we're going in the car museum kind of in the future. And so with that, I'll turn the virtual mic back over to Amanda Gillen to continue us with this great conversation that we're going to have here tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kim. We really appreciate the chance to look at our collection, and it might be a nice chance to say that the Frick Pittsburgh is reopened. We were closed for several months like many museums, but If you are anywhere close to Pittsburgh and can join us, our Car and Carriage Museum, along with other parts of our site, are open. We can talk a little bit more about that at the end, but it's nice to see our collection on screen and to introduce Dr. Sorin to it as well. Speaking of introductions, it is now really an honor and privilege to welcome our very special speaker to us with us this evening. Lizzie and I are so grateful for her time, and we're really thrilled to have the chance to talk with her about her really important, wonderful new book, Driving While Black. Dr. Sorin is Distinguished Professor and Director of the Coopertown Graduate Program in Museum Studies, which is part of the State University of New York. Over the years, she has curated many exhibits at many places like the Smithsonian, the Jewish Museum, and the New York State Historical Association. As director of the Coopertown Museum Program, she has helped countless students, including some on our Frick staff, to find their way into the world with museum careers. And, along the way has been, a tireless champion and advocate for how diverse work in history and museums can be and should be. Dr. Sorin is so many things. She's a professor, she's a historian, she's a mentor, she's a leader, and really someone who we are very excited to have, looking at our collection and talking with us about this topic. Dr. Sorin is also the chair of the board of the Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums, which is an important regional organization for museum professionals. And this is how I know her. I have the honor of serving for her and with her on that board. And it's been a long running joke that I wanted to get Gretchen to come to Pittsburgh to do a program with us. But the trip from upstate New York to Pittsburgh is not an easy one. So this is a best case scenario where we get to have her with us on screen. Also with us is Dr. Elizabeth Barker. Lizzie is the executive director of the Frick Pittsburgh since December. And she has known Gretchen since before this conversation. So I'm really excited to have the chance to reunite them both on screen to have this conversation about the new book, Driving While Black. Welcome, Gretchen. Welcome, Lizzie. Thank you both.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, Amanda. And thank you, Kim and Amy. And Gretchen, thank you so much for making this virtual trip to join us tonight.
Love Pittsburgh. I have been there before, and it is a great city. And I will tell you that the Pittsburgh Courier really informed my research in a lot of ways. The Pittsburgh Courier was such an important African-American newspaper nationally, and it really provided me with a lot of research material.
I'm so happy to hear that. The Pittsburgh Courier name jumped out at me as I was reading your wonderful book and actually sent me off on a little down a rabbit hole to research the Courier. And I love discovering that not only was it the leading Black weekly newspaper in all of the US in the 1930s, but it even kind of anticipated the podcast vogue and had a New York City radio show in the 20s. It must have been amazing.
It was so interesting to see how they carried, all these national stories were in the Pittsburgh Courier. And there really weren't that many African-American newspapers around the country, but people read newspapers that were, far and wide. I mean, you might read the Pittsburgh Courier if you were from New York City, or if you were from Atlanta, or if you were from California. It was mailed out very widely, as was the Chicago Defender. So there were really 4 or 5 major African-American newspapers, and the Pittsburgh Courier was one of those.
Well, thank you for that hometown shout out. It's exciting for us. I think one of the things I was pondering reading your book during this kind of extraordinary year, I was thinking very much about what it means to write a work of history that's so challenging right now. I'm sure some of the people who are tuning in to listen to you tonight are reflecting on the fact that history itself has become contentious.
Mm-hmm.
I think as recently as this month, the President of the United States suggested that it would be appropriate to cut off funding to public schools that taught about the legacy of slavery using the New York Times Pulitzer Prize winning 1619 Project.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you think it was important to write this book? Why should we be reading it now?
Well, what's I started doing this about 20 years ago, maybe more than 20, maybe 25 years ago. I started on this research project, and I started on it because I got curious. I was working on an exhibition in Saratoga Springs, New York, which is also a resort community. And a colleague of mine said, "Have you ever heard of the Negro Motorist Screen Book?" And I said, "No, I never heard of it." And she said, "Well, it was a guidebook for African American families." And I thought, really? I never heard of it. Why did I never hear of it? How can I know African American history and never have heard of this? So I decided this was something I really needed to dig into. So before the movie, before anyone really started looking at the Green Book or thinking about it, I had started doing this research. And it really, for me, was a journey of self-discovery. I started to understand that this was a story that was part of my history and part of my family's history, and that it explained their behavior. It explained my parents' behavior when we went on vacation. It explained their behavior when we went to visit my grandmother in North Carolina. It explained so much about them, and I thought, how did I never hear of this?
Could you tell us a little bit about those remarkable family trips? Am I right in remembering that your father had everybody up and out of the house at 3 a.m?
Yes, absolutely. We were up and out at 3 when it was still dark. And then when I started doing oral history interviews for this program, I found out African American families traveled a lot at night. And they traveled a lot at night because it was harder for people to identify who was driving at night. So there was that fear there that you might be stopped by the police or you might be profiled. And in order to avoid that as much as possible, they drove at night. Well, I thought this was crazy when I was a kid. My parents never said why they did it. But then I started to realize, oh, perhaps that's what they were doing. Perhaps that's why they got on the road at 3 o'clock in the morning, which my brother and I thought was crazy.
It sounds like quite an expedition with a big picnic and.
Well, and then you carried everything you needed. You carried your food. You carried. You might carry extra fan belts. You carried water. You carried blankets and pillows. You might have to sleep in the car. You couldn't stop at a hotel. And I started to think about this. Excuse me. And I realized that their behavior, there was a reason for their behaviors, and that this was something that African American families all over the United States were doing because of the fear that they had when they went out on the road. And
you detail such extraordinary stories in your book. And they really range the gamut from things like looking for a place to stop and use the restrooms to very serious incidents where people needed medical attention.
Right. And something I hadn't thought about, but discovered, my mother had some sort of surgery when she was a young woman, and she had to go all the way from to a hospital called St. Agnes's Hospital that was hundreds of miles from home. And I wondered, why would she have to go so far? Well, because that was the closest Black hospital. There were only 200 African American hospitals in the United States. If you got in a car accident somewhere far away from a Black hospital, you were out of luck. You would not be treated at a white hospital unless they had a Negro ward. And if they did have a Negro ward and it was full, they wouldn't treat you. And usually those Negro wards were very small. So, and they were not very well kept, and they were not very clean. So there were all kinds of dangers when you went out on the road that most kids were unaware of, that parents tried to protect their children. Those of us sitting in the back seat in these big old cars were completely unaware of all of these dangers. And I started to uncover them. I think history is something that in this country we would really like to pretend that certain things that challenge American ideals didn't happen. On the other hand, it seems to me that by shedding light on those things, those bad things that happened, those negative things, you start to show how you can overcome them, how you can make the country stronger, actually, force the country to live up to its ideals, which is what I think the civil rights movement was all about. So rather than, the president saying this makes us weaker, this is unpatriotic, I think this is patriotic. And I think it's important because it enables us to fix things, to make things right.
That's exciting to hear. And it makes me think of the way you talk about how the automobile makes possible so much of the civil rights movement, even aspects of it that don't obviously make you think of needing a car, such as the Montgomery bus boycott, which I thought was about buses.
I love that. I think I had never thought about it before, but without an automobile, people were not able to get to work. You couldn't not take a bus. You had to take a bus to get to work. And people would lose their jobs if they didn't go to work. And so in order to keep them off of the buses, the Montgomery bus boycott organizers bought a fleet of vehicles, of automobiles, and they used those automobiles to drive people to work. That's how they were able to bankrupt the bus company. And this happened in other boycotts. It happened to boycotts in Florida. It happened to boycotts in other states. So these boycotts were only possible because of the car. And the same thing is true with taxi cabs. When taxi cabs were segregated, there were black cabs and there were white cabs. And the black cabs were not allowed to pick up people at the airports because the contracts always went to the white cabs. So if you were a civil rights worker and you flew into an airport, you flew into Atlanta, you flew into Birmingham, you couldn't get from the airport to your hotel, the black hotel in town. However, with a You Drive It car, as they called them, or rental car, you could get from the airport to your hotel. So those cars, those You Drive It cars, become essential to the civil rights movement. The same thing is true of cars for voting rights. And I'll show that slide we talked about earlier. That is a vehicle that's now at the Smithsonian. It's in the Smithsonian collection. If you had to travel around a county to register voters, how would you do that? Well, you would take a car and you would go house to house. You couldn't walk an entire state if you were registering voters. You had to have a car. You had to have a car.
Would you show us some of those slides? You have such wonderful pictures in this book.
Absolutely. Let me get to the first one. If I can figure out how to do that. Oh, screen sharing has stopped. Okay, let me do it. Let me try it again. There's always got to be a tech glitch. So this is an interesting, what you're seeing on the screen. Can you see it now?
Yes.
This is a slave pass. So if you were an enslaved person and you wanted to travel, or you were being asked to do a task, as this man whose name was Benjamin McDaniel, he had to have a pass. And this particular one is from Newmarket, Shenandoah County, Virginia. And he was traveling for, as it says at the end, Mrs. Madison. That's Mrs. James Madison, who was the First Lady of the United States in 1843. And I like to start with this because I want people to think about mobility and how important mobility was and is to all of us. I think now that we're all kind of homebound because of COVID, we're starting to understand how important our mobility is, the opportunity to go where you want to go when you want to go, because we're not able to go anywhere. And it's just we're getting just a little taste of the importance of mobility as a basic right. This is the Negro Motorist Green Book, which was the travel guide that African Americans and most African Americans used when they were going out on the road. And this cover shows you the kinds of places that were included. It's hotels and taverns and garages and nightclubs and restaurants and service stations and tourist homes. So any place of public accommodation that you might go or you might stop if you were traveling. And it made it possible for you to find places that were welcoming, as opposed to places that were either dangerous or that might be humiliating. And I found so many wonderful photographs of people with their cars. You really start to see how proud people were of their automobiles. And this is people of all walks of life, white people, black people, all kinds of people. Everybody we're a country of automobile owners, and we love our cars. And there are so many wonderful photographs of people with their cars. I'll bet there are plenty of folks in Pittsburgh who have snapshots like these. This is one of my family snapshots, which is my brother and I standing behind the family station wagon that we used to take on vacations. And this picture was on an Easter Sunday, as you can tell by our clothes. This is a Pittsburgh photograph. And I love it because it really, first of all, it's a Buick, and Buicks were among the absolute most popular cars that African Americans purchased because they were reliable, they wouldn't strand you, and they were huge. As you can see, it's a big car. And African Americans carried so much gear with them. They carried their food, they carried their blankets and pillows because they couldn't stop at a hotel. They carried the food because they couldn't stop at a restaurant. So there was so much stuff that you needed to carry. But here we've got three gentlemen that have gone hunting, and they've killed 2 bears, and they've strapped them to the front of their big Buick. And I just thought it was such an interesting photograph, and it's by photographer Teenie Harris from Pittsburgh. It's a great photo. And what you can also see a little bit of the houses in the background. When African Americans went out on the road, they faced segregation, and they also faced intimidation. And this is a sign over the main street in Greenville, Texas. Greenville, welcome, the blackest land, the whitest people. But you can imagine African Americans wouldn't feel very welcome seeing this sign. It was also the slogan that they put on their water tower. This is a postcard from the 1950s.
It's just so stunning to imagine that not only that would have existed, but that it would be a postcard.
I
mean,
I know. It's a postcard. Well, there are postcards of lynchings too. So, and that was perfectly acceptable for a while anyway. And they would say things on the back like, here's the barbecue I went to last night, or, things like that. So Americans we can be cruel. This is it's called the Jenkins bus. It's now at the Smithsonian. And this was the bus that was used to travel around in South Carolina to register voters. And they also used it as kind of a rolling schoolhouse. They taught people how to pass the poll test. And they provided health care from this bus, and they traveled all over the state. So, it shows how important the automobile was to making the civil rights movement happen. So
those are so powerful. And I'd love to get back for a minute to the slide of the Green Book, which I think many of us have heard of, but you really gave us a sense of how it developed from a broadsheet to, am I right in thinking this became a woman-run business?
It totally woman-run business. It was Victor Green started it with his brother in New York City, but I think Alma, his wife, was always involved. And then there's something that happens to Victor Green in the late 50s. Something, I don't know what it is. Nobody seems to know. I don't know if he has a heart attack or a stroke, but he writes that he's stepping away. He steps away from the business, and Alma takes over, and she runs the business, and she runs it with 4 other women. And these 5 women, basically they write all the stories, they do all the publication. And this is a time period when women in publishing this was unheard of. There were
Right.
no women in publishing, black, white, or any color. And so Alma is a really, I think it's so important that we talk not just about Victor Green, but also about Alma Green and the women that worked with her to make this publication work.
It's such an inspiring story that she keeps her team together for more than a decade,
Yes.
working collectively with great success.
Yes, and her husband continues to be, until his death in 1960, he continues to be kind of the face of the organization. Even after his death, he's kind of still the face of the organization. But she's really doing all of the work. She's really running the company.
Well, there are so many powerful figures who emerge from this. I love the stories you share about people who ran boarding houses and hotels and restaurants.
I think the other story that is so interesting is women opening their houses to guests, opening their houses to guests who are civil rights workers in the South, but also just opening their houses to travelers and saying, I have a spare bedroom, and using that as extra money to support their families. And they're really operating the earliest bed and breakfasts in this country. I mean, we're talking about starting in the 1930s and 40s, they are running a bed and breakfast. And sometimes they provided dinner as well. But that was the way that women could make extra money if they had a spare bedroom.
And it's exciting to follow that history from boarding houses all the way to really glamorous hotels.
Yes.
I was so struck by the ones in Miami. Is there one in Chicago? You were telling the story where if you were willing to wake up early in the morning, every Monday morning, there was an amazing concert because all of the great musicians in town were staying there and they'd start to perform at 5 a.m.
I think it was in Cleveland.
Cleveland.
Yeah, there were so many that had great jazz clubs in them. And the jazz clubs were frequented by everybody in the city, not just the Black community, because the music was terrific. There were so many different places that I heard people telling stories about. Well, yeah, we went down to hear the music at the jazz club because it was the best music in town, and also because these very small places could get incredible stars performing at them because they weren't allowed to stay in the white hotels. So I've heard many stories of, Muddy Waters and Ella Fitzgerald and B.B. King. They're staying at the Black hotel. They're playing at night at the white hotel or the white club or the white concert venue. And then they have to go to the Black hotel to stay. And they're going to do a free performance or do a very inexpensive performance for the Black community there, so that even little places had these amazing performers. And there was a terrific story from the little town. I grew up in New Jersey, and there was a town not far from the suburb where my parents lived called Scotch Plains, New Jersey. And in Scotch Plains, there's the very first African-American golf club. And it's a really small little golf club. But in the summertime, and they had no air conditioning, in the summertime, they would get these name performers playing, singing in the club and performing in the club. And all the white people would come and they would gather in the parking lot and dance in the parking lot while all the Black folks were dancing inside, because the windows would be open since there was no air conditioning. And I thought it was just a great visual memory of all these folks dancing in the parking lot. And it also speaks to segregation and how segregated the country was, even in the North.
And even after it was technically illegal.
Exactly. Segregation in the North was usually by custom, not by law. Segregation in the South was by law, but segregation in the North by custom or tradition, sadly.
You have such wonderful descriptions of how people whose business was ultimately supported by the automobile, people who ran hotels and restaurants, became critical in supporting the civil rights movement, in providing different kinds of nourishment and sustenance and financial support to some of the protesters. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
I have to give women a lot of credit again, because there were women who made sandwiches and fried chicken and made salads and cake, coconut cake and pound cake, and they sold it during the week. And they would take that money and they would donate that money to the movement. And it was sometimes quite substantial. And there were people that were actually supporting the movement in that way that didn't know they were supporting the movement, because they were buying the food and they didn't realize that the money for that the food they were buying was going to support the civil rights movement. And I just thought that was so, that little clandestine, that little secret was wonderful.
It is.
They were able to get people to support the movement without them knowing.
And so is that image of people being released from jail late at night because the police had held up their processing, and restaurants staying open late to feed the families who were meeting them there.
Isn't that wonderful? And there were, you know, the folks that had these restaurants, that owned these restaurants, often, you know, were some of the largest, they had the largest incomes. They had the Black businesses. They were the ones that were able to feed people in the city, to feed civil rights workers, to feed the students on the lines. And they were, you know, they were supporting the movement by providing these opportunities for people to get together, get reunited with their families after they'd been in jail. They are wonderful stories. And, you know, we don't think about how that, you know, the kind of way that the movement, the civil rights movement, was supported by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who were doing small things like selling sandwiches, or, you know, saving their pennies for the movement, or providing meals for civil rights workers, or providing a place to stay the night for civil rights workers. And sometimes it was quite dangerous to do that. It was quite dangerous to be known to be doing that. And some people did it very quietly and secretly, and other people were very forthright in the way that they supported the movement.
It's an empowering message. And I think all of our viewers will be excited now to delve into the book if they haven't before now. But we should mention that there are different ways to experience this, that it is a book and paper, it's an audio book.
Yes.
And you recorded the intro, is that right?
I did record the introduction.
How was that?
You know, it was an interesting process. I thought about, you know, my husband was saying, well, you should really record the whole thing, because he likes to listen to books that are recorded by the author. But I realized in talking to the woman that was going to do the recording, and she's wonderful. I mean, she's done a terrific job. That's a profession. That's a profession. You really need to be able to do it quickly. And it's very hard. I went to New York and was in a studio to record the introduction, and I realized how difficult it really is. And there are sentences that you repeat over and over and over and over until you get them correct.
Oh, I had no idea. It sounds very smooth when you.
And then they splice it together. But it didn't. I think it took me 2 or 3 hours. So it didn't take that long, but in order to do an entire book, it would take about a week.
Right.
And that's a long time.
That is a long time. Well, and then of course, this project now has become a documentary film, which you launched. Would you tell us about that? And
that's taken 5 years. We've been working on it. Rick Burns, who is the younger brother of Ken Burns, because people always ask, but is a documentary filmmaker, fantastic documentary filmmaker in his own right, and has done New York, a documentary, which was a fantastic documentary. He did a documentary on Oliver Sacks. He's just done some amazing work. He's a terrific historian. He's an old friend, and I approached him and asked him if he would work with me on this project, because I felt that it's such a visual story. There's so many things about it that are visual and that really that just cry out for these images. There's 75 images in the book, and I could have done 75 more. So Rick and I worked together for 5 years, with a great team. And it's a film that will be airing on PBS at 9:00 on the 13th of October.
Tuesday night, we'll all be tuning in. We can't wait.
I can't wait either. It's been a long time. It's been a long time.
When you think about that progress, that journey from your initial research through the book, all the way to the film, is it continuing to evolve? Does it have a next stage?
It's interesting because I have so many more stories now because people write to me and they tell me their stories, and some of the stories are just harrowing, and some of them they're fascinating. And I thought, wow, I should just put these together, all these stories together. One of the things also that I think is so important that I've been thinking about a lot about is, where do we go from here? What's this is so connected with what's going on in the country now. Mm-hmm. So connected to George Floyd and, who was in a car when the police dragged him out. It's so connected to Philando Castile, who was shot in his car. It has real resonance, I think, for any African-American person who has been stopped by the police or has gone out on the road and has been nervous about it. So there is kind of a life for this story that's so related to what's going on in the country right at this moment. And it's an opportunity for us to reflect on what we can do about it.
Right.
How we can make it better.
That's the rallying cry of our moment. That's what future historians will look back on.
It is. It absolutely is.
I've been wondering if there is any kind of modern day equivalent to the Green Book or to any aspect of what it provides.
I don't think so. There is the NAACP several years ago, was it 2018 or 2019? They suggested that African Americans not travel to the state of Missouri. They said that Missouri was a dangerous state for Black people to drive through. And that had never happened before. Even during the period of segregation, the NAACP never said, don't go to this state or that state. So that was a real, that was quite surprising. But there really isn't, although several people have said, well, there really is a need for a modern day Green Book. No one has ever developed one. It would be very difficult, I think to do. I'm not sure exactly how you might start that process.
Well, and it would certainly be a sad thing if it became necessary again.
Yes, but the thing about the Green Book was that hotels and motels were segregated, so it was easy to say these places will be listed in the Green Book because they're segregated. And now that segregation is no longer a part of the landscape, you would have to go by, I think, word of mouth, recommendations. And this is a dangerous place, that's a dangerous place, don't go here, don't go there. It would have to be word of mouth.
I think you're right. Well, I see that we've come up on the time when we wanted to begin to take some questions for the audience, but maybe I'll ease us into that by asking if you would share with everyone the enthusiasm you shared with me when you discovered the Chuck Berry photos.
Oh, that photograph, Chuck Berry had he had several Cadillacs, and the photograph is a photograph of him leaning against his Cadillac, a 50s Cadillac with all those huge fins, and he just loved that car. And it's now at the Smithsonian, but the photograph is just iconic, and he's smiling and he's happy, and you can see this is a man who adores his car. I'm thinking that there are lots of people in Pittsburgh that adore their cars that might share with you their photographs.
We would love that. And that would be such an extraordinary resource for us, especially as we research different shows related to the car museum.
Yes. Oh, that would be great.
Send it in, everyone.
It's also interesting to think about what kinds of cars people buy, because cars are all about, you know, it's all about who you are. I was telling someone that I used to drive a Volvo diesel, and he said, well, that's the appropriate car for a professor. And I thought, oh, is it? Oh, I drive a Toyota now. I don't know what that says. But, you know, the fact that African Americans often drove Buicks was very, that was an interesting discovery. And that, by the way, is something that was very true in Pittsburgh. Buick was a very popular car in Pittsburgh. And the way that I know that is that there was a market study done of African American purchasing habits in Pittsburgh. And it looked at what kinds of cars, and it looked at everything from flour and sugar and baby food. And it looked at brand names, and African Americans in Pittsburgh loved their Buicks as well. So that was a popular car in Pittsburgh.
It makes sense. You need something reliable to get up and down those hills.
Exactly.
And to wait to get over the bridges.
Oh, that's true. That is true.
Through the magic of Zoom, I can weirdly appear and disappear to join the conversation again. I have a couple of comments that have come in from the audience that I just wanted to share with the group, and invite everyone now, if you have questions, please post them in the chat or the Q&A. We have a couple of things to talk about. But one comment came early on from Kim Jordan. We were talking about, this the first part of the conversation about the Green Book. And the comment was, the need for the Green Book absolutely explains some of the cultural rituals an expedition laced with fear for one's family. So this idea of trying to do something fun and you know, have your family out exploring, but with these undertones and overtones of worry. And another comment from actually one of our Frick staff members about the fact that Michelle Obama wrote quite a bit about how proud her dad was of his car.
Yeah.
She talked about that as a point of pride for him.
Yes. And he liked to polish it. And that was one of the things that I heard from some people, that they were even afraid to go on vacation or afraid to take their, I talked to Spencer Crew about his family, and Spencer is the deputy director of no, he's the interim director of the National African American Museum at the Smithsonian now. And he said that his family his father had this great car. It was called a deuce and a quarter it was called. And he would polish it every weekend, but they wouldn't go anywhere. They didn't go anywhere. His father that was his ritual, to polish that car and keep it shining and beautiful. But they never went anywhere because they were afraid to go very far from home. So having that car was important, but they didn't take it anywhere.
Another question about just the Pittsburgh Courier. You know, this is something, there's a historian here in Pittsburgh, Gretchen. I don't know if you know Sam Black over at the Heinz History Center.
I do.
Sam, wonderful gentleman and historian who, you know, I've known for a while, and he recently did a talk for one of our libraries about the Pittsburgh Courier. And I was honestly ashamed. I knew of the paper. I didn't know the extent to its reach, its value.
How important it was.
It's incredible, you know, value as a historical resource. And you use this quite a bit in the work. I mean,
Yes.
I'm really thrilled to see Pittsburgh come up over and over again in your book.
Yes, it had national importance. I mean, the Pittsburgh Courier was not just a Pittsburgh paper; it was a national paper. And George Schuyler, one of the columnists, who wrote for it, was a national syndicated columnist for Black newspapers. I mean, it was a really important national newspaper.
Yeah,
And it's fascinating. It's, you know, reading it is fascinating because the news that African Americans were getting is very different from the news that's in the mainstream white dailies. And the Pittsburgh Courier is reporting on things that never appear in the white dailies.
Was that all online? How did you even do that research?
There's actually a database of the major Black newspapers: the Pittsburgh Courier, the Baltimore Afro-American, the Chicago Defender. There are 5 of them. The Atlanta Daily World, and there's one more. And it's keyword searchable, and it is only available. It's very expensive. It's $25,000 a year to have the ProQuest, and most of the libraries that I have access to do not have it, but I was mentioning the other day that I was successful in convincing 3 different libraries to get a free trial, and I used it.
Give this away.
The tricks of a historian.
I used it for a month here and a month there. I used it for a month here and a month there and a month here, and because it was keyword searchable, I would, you know, just type in, I just thought about, I wrote down lists of words that were my topic, you know, Green Book, Esso gasoline, women in business, publishing, just dozens and dozens of words. And I searched them, read all the articles, and then downloaded the articles. So I was able, to be able to keyword search Black newspapers was an amazing research tool for me, because the newspapers had incredible stories, and then I could match those stories with other information that I had, other evidence, and it would also give me other avenues to investigate. So if there's a story in the paper, I could then go and look for individuals that could expand on that story, or a historical society in that community that could expand on that story. So that was kind of my my MO. And I did a lot of oral histories as well for the research.
And it was, I know you said this, how many years ago did you start this project?
I think 25.
I think it's in your intro maybe where you reference your children being small when this research started.
They were, yes, and now they're adults. They're grown, and I have 2 grandchildren, so you can see it's taken a long time. But I didn't start out to write a book. I started out to do an exhibition, and then it grew into a dissertation, and it went from a dissertation to a book. And I think that a lot of historians had probably looked at the Negro Motorist Green Book, but couldn't do anything with it, because all it is, it's like a phone book. It literally, do I have it? I had one. I had a facsimile. It's literally like a phone book. It lists the state, so it would say Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then it would list the names of the places, Mrs. Jones Guest House, and then it would have, the later editions had the phone number, the early editions just had the address, and that was it. It was basically names, addresses, phone numbers, and it's hard to make something out of that. You know, so if you start, you know, what are you going to do with that? It doesn't tell you, there's not a lot of detail there. The later editions, there are some print ads, and there's about 1 article in each Green Book. So it's not easy to make something out of the Green Books. But I was looking at it as an artifact. like you would think of a museum artifact, as opposed to thinking of it as just a document. You know, how can this artifact, what can I pull out of this artifact? And I think thinking of it from a material culture perspective gave me a lot more jumping off points, to investigate. You can look at it as a geographer, and you can map the places in the Green Book. You can look at it and try and figure out the density of places. There are many. There are 244 in New York. There are lots in Pennsylvania. There are almost none in Iowa. There are almost none in Nevada. So you can start to see the density and you can match that against the African American communities in the United States. I mean, you could start to think of it broader, more broadly than just a historical document, if that makes sense.
I hope we have some students listening. I think you've just handed out some great future dissertation topics. It's been really interesting, mapping the big data of the Green Book.
Doing African American history is not always easy, because people didn't feel that their history was valued, and so they haven't saved everything, perhaps. And so you really have to dig for it. And the Green Book is, there are no business records. Alma and Victor Green didn't have children, and nobody saved those records for that business, at least none that anybody has ever found. So it's really difficult to kind of reconstruct their story from relatively scant sources. And I did talk to their nephew. He's one of the people that's quoted in the book, but they really don't have a lot of relatives and no children.
Mm. Wow. And that raises that interesting question of what is saved? What do we know about history, and what do museums hold? And
what do museums save? Right. And that's a good question. I think museums are starting to think more broadly about what to save and whose objects to save. And also, that whole idea of what's museum quality. I think we're thinking more broadly about what is museum quality. I think in terms of stories. I love the stories. And if you can get an object that'll help you tell a story, that's a great object. And if it'll tell many stories, that's an even better object. So as I was writing this and doing the research for this, I was thinking about, what are the things that tell these stories? So then I could go dig into that. So I could say, okay, well, hospitals, what is this about Black hospitals? Can I dig into that a little bit and find out how that relates to African-American automobile accidents? Can I dig into college, who are the people that were traveling? Baseball players and musicians. So can I dig into the biographies of musicians and see what they have to say about their cars? And guess what? They talk about them. Mahalia Jackson talks about her car. Sammy Davis talks about his car. So I got very adept at reading biographies and finding those little tidbits of stories about automobiles. And everybody talks about them. Everybody talks about their cars.
We had one more question come in if we have time. It's a good one. It was impressive to read examples of the economic power African Americans could wield, especially related to automobiles. Can you speak to how or if companies like, is it ESSO,
Yep.
or Buick rewarded such community buying loyalties, or at least acknowledged them?
That's really an interesting question. I don't think that Buick did anything. I think they should. I think they still should. But Esso was really excited about the idea, Esso, which is now Exxon, by the way. Mm-hmm. Esso started out Standard Oil, and it became Exxon. Excuse me. And they had what I would call enlightened self-interest. They realized that African Americans were going to be a market that they should exploit, and that other people were not exploiting it. So they hired African Americans as marketers to market to the Black community and to tell the Black community that they were willing to allow Black people to use their bathrooms. Black people can use the bathrooms at Esso gas stations. So what gas are Black people going to buy? They're going to buy Esso. And when I talked to people, when I interviewed people and asked them, well, what kind of gas did you put in your car? Almost everybody said, oh, I used Esso gas. And obviously that was because Standard Oil was promoting this idea of you can use our restrooms. So did they reward the communities? Not really, but they didn't. My understanding is that Esso generally did not discriminate, which was a real plus for Black people who were traveling to be able to use the restrooms.
Thank you. I'm getting a bunch of thank yous from all of us, from the participants. This has been wonderful. You know, this book, Kim and I were so excited when we got our hands on it, when it finally came in. You know, at the Frick and museums around the country are reading and thinking, and every so often there's a book that we come across that is an important benchmark and something that we need to read and need to learn from, and that will hopefully spur, as we were saying, a whole bunch of other work and research that's important. And I think we feel that this is one of those books. And
I'm going to have to come out to Pittsburgh to see that exhibition.
I was going to say,
great.
We'll hold you to it, Gretchen, to come and see us.
And by the way, you can get the Green Book there are facsimiles available on eBay for $5 or $6. So you can actually get copies of the Green Book that people can flip through, which I think is kind of interesting.
That would be great.
Yeah. And
Thank you to all of you who are sending in your comments. Everybody is very appreciative, Gretchen, of your time and for joining us tonight. We can't
thank you so much.
Lizzie, thank you as well, and Kim for introducing our collection, hopefully new to some people. We will get Gretchen to the Frick, and if any of you, are, as I said, nearby, come and see us. We're open, we are safe, we are wearing masks, we are doing this. Our cafe is open with picnics on the weekends, so before it gets cold, come and visit us, and maybe we'll be able to entice Dr. Sorin to do a live program sometime in the future when it's possible.
That would
Sounds
great.
like a plan.
I'd love to get out of the house. Bye-bye, everybody.
Good night. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lizzie.
Thanks, Gretchen. Thanks, everyone.